Welcome back to the Harbor Online Community YouTube channel. I'm John, joined today by Dawn, and we're really excited to be chatting about the Sermon on the Mount. We're in the middle of a 4-week discussion series at Harbor in our Thursday night gatherings, and we're going to talk about our second and third gatherings that took place on the Sermon on the Mount last week at the time of this recording. Week 2, we talked about loving your enemies, and Dawn shared the content for that week. So Dawn, can you walk us through a little bit of what we looked at and talked about loving enemies?
Sure. So I'm Canadian and didn't realize that this was falling on the Thursday before Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And not knowing that, I grabbed a bunch of quotes from a sermon, and we actually heard from Dr. King himself. And so we were looking at the part where Jesus says, I do not say, Jesus says, you have heard it said, hate your enemies. I say to you, love your enemies. And then what that looks like. And one of the things I've been curious about for a while is how we have lost this word enemy in our discourse. And I don't think that's good or bad, but I do think it's interesting because I wonder if I live in a culture that is very civil and very polite. And so I wonder, and partly because we understand people's motivations, we're hesitant to say, I am not them. We don't do that, which I appreciate. But then I wonder, so then if we don't see anyone as our enemy, who are we loving? And so I pushed back and said, I think we still need to acknowledge that we have opponents, that we have adversaries, even if we don't want to use the word enemy. And then things like the Psalms make more sense when we can think about how those feelings are presented. Martin Luther King preaches on this passage, and he talks about the ways that hating our enemy distorts us and distorts the world. Like the way that, if you're just if you're just fighting fire with fire, you're just making more flames. It distorts us as human beings. We are angrier. And it distorts how we see the world. It's hard to see beauty when we are in a place of hate. And then we listened to Dr. A.J. Levine, who is a Jewish scholar on the Gospels, and she has such incredible takes. And so it was actually a sermon about the parable of the Good Samaritan. And she says, the way she ends it is beautiful. She says, we are not the Samaritan. We are the person in the ditch. And the enemy is the Samaritan is the enemy. The Samaritan is the one who is coming to save us. And what this parable is teaching us is that it's not just love your enemy, it's recognize God in your enemy and recognize that your enemy may actually be the one to save you. Mic drop. And then we just had some really fascinating discussions about conflict and enemies and radical acceptance.
Yeah, it was a great week. Thanks for recapping that for us.
Yeah. And then this week, you last night you brought us into a different portion of the Sermon on the Mount. Why don't you tell us?
Yeah, so at the end of chapter 6 of Matthew, there's this discourse from Jesus, this monologue from Jesus about worry and why the reasons we shouldn't worry or we shouldn't be anxious about our lives, about what we're going to eat or wear. And we looked at a couple interesting articles about worry and anxiety and trying to get to the bottom of like, what is anxiety or worry? What does it look like in our lives? And what does our faith have to do with our probably daily experiences with anxiety or worry or fear? And one of the articles was from a medical doctor, who was reflecting on the role of anxiety and fear in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. and he was looking at Aquinas. And so we looked at how you can think of anxiety as an emotion, which it's kind of neutral or even a good thing, because it shows that we love ourselves enough to care what happens to us. We love others enough to care what happens to them. So we fear for them or for ourselves. We have worry, anxiety. Um, but it can also become a way of living. And this is a distinction that Aquinas made, where um, he said it's okay as an emotion. It's a good thing sometimes. When it becomes a way of living, it becomes really problematic. And the doctor who wrote the article we looked at, Warren Kinghorn, he gave really concrete examples from the middle of the pandemic. He said the people who didn't care at all about the pandemic and went out into public places and made super spreader events, like, they didn't have enough anxiety because they didn't have enough love. But on the other hand, the people who hoarded masks and disinfectant wipes, the people who were hoarding resources so that only they and their immediate loved ones could be safe at the expense of other people who needed those resources desperately, those people were exhibiting what it means to like live anxiety as a way of living. And it's also a lack of love for the other, for those outside your circle. So I thought that was really, really interesting. And then we also looked at some thoughts from Soren Kierkegaard via a theologian, Karol Zaleski, in thinking about very similar to Aquinas, actually, this idea that like anxiety can be a good thing or a bad thing. What does it look like for anxiety to be a good thing? And for Zaleski and her reading of Kierkegaard, it has to do with, can it be channeled into something positive? Can it spur us toward, she named some things like humility, repentance, awe. If we can allow our anxiety to move us in those directions, then that's what it means to like have good anxiety, or to experience our anxiety in a good way. And all of this, of course, we talked about in light of Jesus's teachings on worry and anxiety in the Sermon on the Mount. He's giving reasons for us not to worry, and as standalone bits of advice, they might be helpful. But it's really good to think through what they mean, both in Jesus's context and in our own. So that's what we were trying to do at our Harbor gathering. And yeah, I loved the conversations we had. I was really grateful for the wisdom everyone brought, talking about anxiety.
Yeah, me too. Um, the discussion groups I've found have been one of the things I love about the way we do our learning is it's very experiential, and we really honor people's experiences. And over these past 2 weeks, we've been talking a lot about some of us having a conflict within our families, with people we care about, but also, the as the primaries are here, a lot of anxiety among our Americans, but not just our Americans, like everybody's watching, and seeing November coming ahead, even though it's like 11 months away. And so being able to look at how we see opponents and also how we worry, I think, has been really healing and a kind of way of bringing us together. What the link I've noticed, and then of course we did the Beatitudes the week before, where again it's like, blessed are the meek, blessed are peacemakers, blessed are, and so something that's been coming up, I've been hearing not just at Harbor but in around me, is this idea of radical acceptance. And I think it started with a tweet from Beth Moore as she saw what was coming out of the Iowa caucuses, and just going like, I need to rethink how I imagine the world. And she used this phrase, and our country and the people in our country. And she used this term radical acceptance. And over the past 2 weeks in my discussion group, we've been talking about like, what is that? And I think here's where I'm at with it. I think to radically accept someone is to accept that they are who they are. It doesn't mean I have to accept their abuse. It doesn't mean I have to accept their vision of the world, but it takes away the pressure for me to want to change that person. I've given up the idea that this person will change, or that the people who are voting a particular way are going to change their mind. I'm going to accept them as they are. Now, what do I do? And it's straight, like, it does kind of put folks back on you, but it does strangely take this pressure off of having to change the world on my
Yeah.
own.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's really cool. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I feel like what has really struck me in this series so far, in the breakout rooms chatting with folks, is just how relevant all of these themes are to our lives still 2000 years later. I think one reason is that, in my
Mm.
opinion anyway, I just that there's a lot of really great wisdom in what Jesus is saying in this sermon, so I think that that's one of the reasons, but also just the things human beings deal with are just across culture and across the other side of the world in 2000 years. It's a lot of the same stuff. And a couple brief notes on that. When we talked about loving our enemies, like you pointed out a few minutes ago, we don't like the word enemies, and we don't like to think of ourselves as having any. And this was so funny. You had shared that idea as we went through the content on that Thursday night gathering. Then as soon as we got to my breakout room, the first question was like, do you have enemies? And it was like every single person lining up to just be like, nope, none here, not an enemy in sight, don't know what an enemy is, not in my life. And it's just like we were doing the exact thing that you were talking about. And but as we talked about it more, we started to think back on specific relationships and situations we've been in, and we were like, oh, I had a big conflict with that person. I really hurt them, they really hurt me, whatever. We never reconciled. Like,
Mm.
that is kind of what an enemy is, right? Like that's and so I think it gave a really helpful real life context for us to talk about some of the more theoretical, stuff about love and hatred. And then this past discussion talking about anxiety, I was blown away. I won't go into any details or a lot of really
Yeah.
personal stories shared, but just remarkable how common both whether it's like a diagnosed, like a very like a mental health reality that people deal with, or an undiagnosed but just very common daily um wrestling with anxiety levels. And it just turned out to be a very, very relevant, and I was really grateful for the vulnerability of folks sharing like their own
Mm.
experiences with that.
Yeah. Yeah, same in our group. And I also live with an anxiety disorder. And I'll this will be the last thing I say, because there's a phrase that we say, the opposite of faith is not doubt, it's fear. And I actually love that phrase. But hearing it in this context, and we also saw how this text has been weaponized, that if you worry, you lack faith. Um, I mean, that phrase is talking more in a societal way, but all of a sudden I was like, why? Hmm. I wonder what we're saying when we say the opposite of faith is fear. Um, and trying to, as coming back to Aquinas, which like just made my little Anglican heart burn. I was so excited. And um, that we, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, the last thing I'll say now is, in terms of juxtaposing faith and fear, I remember going back to the COVID-19 pandemic. I remember some of the churches I know who were flouting the regulations, who were saying, we're going to be open for Sunday worship. We don't care what the infection levels are, the hospitalization levels, no masks, no social distancing. A lot of those churches were saying faith, not fear, faith over fear. It was like a
Mhm.
rallying cry. I was trying to start up a counter slogan. It did not take off, but I was trying to start up sacrifice, not selfishness, right? Like if we want to have alliteration, because
Yeah.
you selfishly want to have the church service, whether it's because you like getting together for church or because you work for the church and you need the money to come in and the collections. But either way, you have a selfish motivation. but it's not safe. You are endangering people. You should be sacrificing some of the things you like or love in order to promote the wellness and safety of the people that you presumably love. So anyway, a lot of directions to take these important themes. But thanks for chatting today, Don, and we look forward to one more week of discussing Sermon on the Mount.
All right. We'll see you later.
See ya.